Welcome once again to the course Life of Christ. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount. Class 17 is a two-part class that talks about how to be sexually pure in today's world. And I want to say that, in my opinion, perhaps it's maybe more difficult to be sexually pure at this time in history than at any time before. There are a lot of important, complex issues that are being addressed today in every kind of environment. While we talk about these things, I want to respect each person and the value that each person has before God. I want to be thoughtful. I want to study and learn as much as I can to be informed and to be kind and compassionate in every way with every person. And at the same time, as a Christian, also want to value the Word of God, what it teaches, what Jesus wants for each one of us, and try to respect that and live that out in my life, and I'd like others to be able to do the same. And part of my goal is to be able to be the kind of teacher and person and Christian that can talk with other people in deep ways and caring ways so that we can learn and be obedient as much as we can to what Jesus would have us do. And so in this two-part class, we want to look at many issues that are of concern to us in the area of how can we be sexually pure in today's world. If you look at the world today, you see so many TV shows and movies and internet sites just saturated with sex. You see the whole idea of friends with benefits. You see changes in standards, both of what is expected or not expected, what used to be disapproved of and is now not disapproved of. And I know it must be confusing to everyone as they try to work through the changing standards and the change in society. And so I think, again, it's probably harder now to be sexually pure than at any time in history, largely because of the accessibility of much more material online in different ways. So today what we want to do is to begin reading, as always, in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, beginning in verse 27, what Jesus says about adultery, and then we'll go on from there to expand the discussion a little bit. You've heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, that's a very difficult passage, and we talked about the radical nature of Jesus' teaching and practice when we discussed the intro to the Sermon on the Mount. I've read this passage many, many times. I've taught through it. I've heard sermons and classes on it. I've discussed this with my friends and colleagues and fellow elders. It's just a difficult passage to understand and to apply. I don't think that Jesus wants us to take it literally in terms of gouging out eyes and cutting off hands, because according to most human bodies, you only get 4 chances to mess up, and then after that, what? And so I think this is, in a sense, hyperbole in the sense of, he doesn't really want us to cut off hands and gouge out eyes, but he is utterly serious about sexual purity. And what makes this difficult, if you look at it, is where sin begins. And if you look at how Jesus looks at this topic and also other topics in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a certain pattern where you have the sin begin as a seed or a thought in the heart, in the mind, inside, invisible, where no one can see it. And it may be taking root and growing for a long time and nobody knows a thing except the person themselves, and maybe even the person isn't that aware of what is happening. And then you kind of move outward. If you start here in the middle here with this center dot of thinking, then you move outward and you think, okay, well, what would that be like if I did something about that? What would it be like to sleep with that person? How would that work? How would we have to begin? Where would we meet? What would we talk about? How would I set this up? It's still invisible. It still hasn't happened physically yet, but that's a major move toward committing a sin. And then you actually have, if it continues on, you actually have the physical act when you take those thoughts and plans and you put them into action, and then you commit the sin. And Jesus says the sin begins back with the thinking, which is hard for us. We're used to the sin being called a sin only when it gets to the physical act. But Jesus says, no, it really starts way before then, and that's where it has to be cut off if you're going to address it. It's a heart problem. It's a matter of the heart and the mind. And so I want to talk more about maybe the roots of sexual purity or impurity, and talk about the idea of porneia, which, as you might guess, is the root word in Greek for pornography. And not only pornography, but also other things connected to it. For example, in Greek, if you look at the lexicon and you see porneia, it means fornication, which is generally considered to be sex with somebody you're not married to, right? Outside of, you're not married yet and you're having sex with other people. It's also defined as sexual immorality of different kinds. It's kind of a broad term that takes in various kinds of sexual immorality. It can be translated as prostitution as well. Okay. Number two, it can also be used to apply to adultery, which we generally consider as sex with other people besides your spouse. In other words, now you're married, and now it changes the term a little bit because you're married. So it's adultery now, marital unfaithfulness. And that's mentioned again in verse 32 when Jesus says, if you divorce your wife except for sexual immorality or unfaithfulness, then you make her the victim of adultery. So that's the same word there. And then you could also use it metaphorically. In other words, it may not be physical adultery, but it may be spiritual adultery, like apostasy from God, through idolatry, through spiritual immorality, unfaithfulness, as the Israelites were accused of so many times in the Old Testament, and obviously we can be accused of today as well. And then also, kind of in a broader sense, the idea of being porneia, acting in that way, it's living without sexual restraint. And you think about 1 Corinthians 6:18 through 20, that says, look, our bodies don't belong to us as Christians. If we're Christians, they, were bought with a price, and now they belong to God. We're the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so God's in charge of how we use our bodies. We are not in charge of it anymore if we are servants of the Lord. And so a porneia person would be one that lives without any of that kind of guideline or restraint, that is, do whatever they want. So you can see it's a pretty broad word. For our purposes in this class, we want to start out also talking more specifically about pornography, which actually describes a number of these acts and attitudes. And I have a number of stats here I'd like to treat in different ways, just to give you an idea of some of the situation if you weren't already aware of it. Some of these stats did not surprise me, even though they're sad, and other stats, frankly, kind of surprised me. I didn't realize some of these. For example, Pornhub, provider of pornography, says their site put out 75 gigabytes of pornography per second last year. 75 gigabytes per second. That's enough to fill 175 iPhones that have 16 gig memories, for a total of 87.8 billion views just on their site, Pornhub's, of pornography. Now that's one site, and that's 1 year. So that's an amazing quantity there. Other facts: an adult site usually contains between 50 to 200 terabytes of pornography, and that's a lot. A terabyte is a huge amount, and that's just, again, one site, and it makes up 30%. Maybe some estimates have as much as 48% of all the internet. And that's the surface internet. That's not counting the dark internet, the one that's a little bit more hard to get to, and it's a lot worse things happening on it. This is the internet that's accessible to everyone. The porn industry, according to this, makes $3,000 per second, and I think that's an old stat. I think it's more now. 87% of university men look at porn every day or week. 30% of university women watch it, which is significantly less, but it's still 30%, almost a third. An APA study, American Psychological Association study, said that if offered the opportunity, 86% of men will look at pornography. That's amazing. Kid Rock, one of the authorities maybe in some areas of music, he says that a man will be as faithful as his opportunities. You think about that, that may be true, but it's also pretty sad. And now if you look at pornography in our children, go back to another area, one online survey says that 97% of boys had seen pornography and 80% of all girls had seen it. We're not talking about necessarily every week or day, but just had seen it at some point. 9 of 10 children between 8 to 16 years old have seen pornography on the internet, mainly by accident at that young age. And the majority of those 8 to 16-year-olds saw it while doing homework. And then the question would be, did they go back to the sites when their parents didn't find it, or maybe just, again, not knowing where to go? This same survey also says the largest group of consumers of pornography are those between 12 and 17 years old. And 66% of men who are between the ages of 18 and 34 years old visit a pornographic site every month. 2/3 of every man, at least one per month. 39% of teens and 59% of young adults have sent or posted sexually suggestive emails or text messages, the sexting. 46%, almost half, of adolescents say that sending sexually explicit or nude photos is part of their daily life. That's almost half. And then 86% of the content produced by teens under 15 years old was produced by webcam. And so whereas when I was in college a number of years ago, you didn't have webcams and you had open nights and you had dorms that were not co-ed. So the only way a woman was going to get into your dorm room was either on an open night, open house night, or it was going to be sneaked in. Now, you can get into any dorm room, anywhere, just by webcams that are part of every laptop. And so again, a lot more accessible. But in comparison to all these stats that show the high usage of porn by adolescents and children, only 12% of parents know their kids are watching porn. And so you may have as high a percentage as 80-something% of kids watching it, but maybe only 12% knowing that it's happening. Now you might say, well, but that's the general population stats. Christians should be better off. Christians should have more self-restraint and the stats should be lower. But sadly, in some areas, they're not. In fact, in some areas, they may even be a little bit worse. One stat is that 21% of Christian men and 2% of Christian women believe that they are porn addicts. Porn addicts, not just watch it, but are addicts. That compares to 10% of non-Christian men that are addicts. So it's almost double the amount of Christian men that are addicts as opposed to non-Christians. That's awfully strange. 47% of Christians said that porn was a big problem in the home, almost half. 29% of Christians in the U.S. think it's morally acceptable to watch movies with explicit sexual content. Not just that they watch it, but they disapprove, but they watch it as part of the movie. They say it's okay. There's no problem with it. And in a survey of Christian leaders and pastors, this is the people that are leading the church, whom you hope and think would be, more under control. 64% said they're struggling with sexual addiction, such as the use of porn, masturbation, or other secret sexual activity. And that's Christians on all those last set of stats. Now, you might think also there's generational differences, and there are, but maybe not the way that you would expect. Among those who use porn, less than 33% of the population considered that these things were pornographic. These things are nude dancing, sex scenes in books or movies, or sexting with unknown people. 33% said they're not pornographic. Many older adults think that porn is immoral And so they criticize and look down on the young people who are involved in different kinds of porn. And yet, if you have the young people look at the old people, they criticize the older folks for not being more involved in things like social justice and even like recycling, concern for the environment. They think that that is more immoral than pornography. And so again, just a different way to think about things generationally. 22% of adults between 18 and 24-year-old think that porn is very good for society. And their justification is that it's more open, it explains more things, it lets people choose more, and that openness is better than driving it underground and not knowing what's happening. Okay? And so again, just some generational perspectives on the problem. If you went to pornography and violence, how does pornography impact violence or vice versa? 88% of porn scenes in movies or videos contain some kind of physical aggression, and 48% have verbal aggression. That's a lot. 94% of these acts are committed against women, not men. Men who watch porn tend to be more willing to rape a woman and believe the myths associated with rape, that it's okay, that women really want it, those kinds of things. There's a greater percentage or tendency to believe that. They're also more likely to force or persuade their partners to perform acts that they don't want to do. And so again, while people may say this doesn't affect me, the stats show that actually it does have an effect, sometimes a large effect on actions. And then they did studies about how pornography affects the brain and have found that it actually physically impacts the brain and how the brain functions. It says the way in which porn intensely stimulates the brain is similar to drug addiction, and that's why you have sexual addiction, and can make people addicts to sex as much as drugs. As the number of hours watching porn increases, the amount of gray matter in the brain actually decreases. And so again, not just spiritually or morally, but it's actually physically impacting the brain of those who are involved in it. So if you look at all those stats, and those are just a few of the many that are out there, they're relatively up to date, but they may have gotten worse since I researched for this class. You think, wow, this is a huge problem, but there's always this tendency to think that where I am and where I live, the people I'm around, they don't struggle with it as much. I don't see this, or I'm not sure that it's happening to the same extent as the stats we just quoted. And so that's why when we go to the next page, you wonder about, okay, what's it like in my community? And one way to measure that and find out is the number of registered sex offenders in the country, in states, and in cities. One stat from the government says there are over 644,000, almost 645,000 registered sex offenders in the United States, and another 10,000 have been lost in the system. So over 650,000 sex offenders, people that have been caught and registered. Doesn't mention people who haven't been caught or have been lost. And that's a stat from 2008. And so probably be a lot more now. So the question is, where are they in your neighborhood? And so you might be surprised. I went and I did for the town where I live. And this is the map of sex offenders that was on one government site. Abilene is a pretty small town, a little bit over 100,000. It's got 3 Christian universities. It's got hundreds of churches, different kinds. It's got a lot of good people and good things going on. And frankly, I was surprised to see how many registered sex offenders live in Abilene and where they live. Close to all the churches. There's some close to every church. There's some close to every university that's a Christian university. And it's just a reality. And I would bet that, and no matter where you live, you probably have more living near you than you think. It's not something necessarily to say, let's get rid of those people, let's kill those people. That's not the point. The point is to be aware of it and to see how you can help your family and friends deal with that, and also how you can help the people that are struggling with sex addiction, because as Christians, we're called to help that as well. Also, in addition, date rape is a growing reality. In every university, in many schools, just outside of school and businesses, date rape is common, more common than you would think. Many people that experience it don't admit it. And just as they don't admit more violent rapes, there's still a stigma attached to it, to where the person who is raped thinks that they would be blamed for being raped, for being the victim. And sadly, that does occur. Or friends of the person who raped the woman will talk to the woman and make that woman feel bad about what she did or didn't do. And so there's a lot of stigma and complex issues around things like date rape, and that's just one aspect of the sexual landscape today. And so you think about all of these things, and you feel a little bit hopeless. You wonder how you can help, or how you can stop it, how you can help people that are trapped in these areas. And the short answer is we can't solve it all at once, and we can't solve them all by ourselves, of course. But I think we can be a positive influence, not only for our family, our churches, our neighborhoods, our communities, and we can show that it's possible to be sexually pure and what that looks like. Because sadly, many people that are trapped in these cycles of pornography or in abusive relationships or in families, they may never have seen what a Christian sexual relationship looks like. They may never know what the rules are for that, how you arrive at that and maintain that purity. And as Christians, one of our jobs is to help people know it is possible. And in fact, sex within a Christian marriage is one of the best things in the world that God made to be enjoyed. And yet some people have no idea how to get there and maintain it. And so in the next class, we're going to talk about different ways that Christians can achieve and maintain sexual purity, even though it's a struggle for every single person. So looking forward to that. Hope that this has been helpful to you. We'll see you in the next class.